Welcome to Psych 232, Theories of Personality. Today we are continuing with Bandura's theory of personality, which is the social learning approach. It's actually a theory of psychology, one of the grand theories. Okay, it's called social learning, but it also applies to personality. So we covered about half the PowerPoint already, covered about half the theory. Today we need to talk about self-efficacy and some other things that are important that have to do with Bandura's theory. So self-efficacy, what is self-efficacy? Self-efficacy are feelings of adequacy, competence in coping with life, believing in ourselves. Let me explain that, okay? All of you know what self-esteem is. Self-esteem is how you feel about yourself, okay? Whether you feel good or bad about yourself, that's your self-esteem. Self-efficacy is kind of like self-esteem, but it's about what you do. So if you feel that you can do things well, if you think you are competent and you feel that you can succeed at what you do, what you try, then you have high self-efficacy. If you don't believe in yourself and you think you're going to fail, you think you can't do things well, then you have low self-efficacy. That is what self-efficacy is. Kind of like self-esteem, but it's about what you do. So self-efficacy is how effective you think you are, how well you think you can do things. So meeting standards enhances self-efficacy. Failing to meet standards reduces it. So when you do well on something, let's say you write a paper and you get a good score on your paper, you get a good grade, right? Meeting the standards, let's say the teacher's standards, or even your own standards about how well you think you should do that, meeting these standards actually enhances self-efficacy. It makes you feel good. It makes you feel like you can do well. It makes you feel like you can do even better. Failing to meet standards reduces it. If you don't do very well, then that reduces your self-efficacy, and therefore you feel you can't do things very well. And if self-efficacy goes down, then you will probably do worse on your next assignment because you will believe that you can't do very well. You're less likely to try, and then you're more likely to do even worse. So doing well on things increases your self-efficacy, and that makes you do even better, okay? And failing to do well on things or failing things, right, reduces your self-efficacy, and then you have a tendency to get worse. People with low self-efficacy, for instance, feel helpless. They feel unable to control life events. So they feel they can't do very well. They can't control what happens to them, okay? They quickly give up and may not even try. They feel unmotivated, have low aspirations. They have impaired cognitive abilities and impaired physical health. People who don't believe in themselves, basically, people who don't believe they can do things well, just may not even try. And if they try, they give up easily. So they tend to do poorly. And then when they do poorly, their self-efficacy goes down even more. And then their motivation goes down even more. And then they do even worse. And you can go into a downward spiral. And you can basically get into a downward spiral, like I said, where you continue to do worse and worse, and basically your life just becomes horrible. I know because I've experienced that. When I first went to college, I didn't do very well, and I felt bad about myself, and then I basically didn't want to go to school. I didn't want to go to lecture anymore. I didn't want to try, so I did even worse, and then I felt even worse about myself, right? And then eventually I stopped caring about my education, and then I even ended up failing classes that I knew I could do well in, and it just got worse and worse, and things didn't work out for me at that college. I dropped out of that college, and then later on I had to pick myself back up and start again, and that's the story of my education. Eventually I did well, right? But low self-efficacy has a way of kind of just making you feel worse. And then things get worse when you feel worse. That's what happens. But the opposite can happen with those that have high self-efficacy. People with high self-efficacy believe they can deal effectively with life events. They believe they can do well. They expect to succeed. They persevere. Even when things get tough, right? They keep going, they keep trying, and they perform at a high level. They view difficulties as challenges, not threats. When there's a paper coming up, an exam, they don't see that as a threat that's going to ruin them, right? They see it as a challenge, something that they have to rise to and try to do well at. They seek novel situations. They seek new challenges. They're not as fearful, right? They have increased aspirations. They set greater goals for themselves, right? They solve problems better, and they have better analytical skills. They're better able to focus, they're better to think, they're better able to analyze things. And I have also experienced this as well. Here's the thing, like I said, low self-efficacy has a way of kind of spiraling kind of downward. So at first, when I went to college, I wasn't ready. I went to an Ivy League school, by the way. I went to MIT. I did very well in high school and, did very well in math. And the teachers said, my counselors basically say, hey, you should go to, you should apply to MIT, should be an engineer. So I did, and I got in there, and I wasn't ready, okay? I wasn't able to do that level of work at MIT, okay? The lowest level of math at MIT is calculus. They offer nothing lower. And I was ready for that. I had taken AP calculus and I did okay in that class. But there was also biology, chemistry, physics, and those classes I was not ready for. Though I had taken those in high school, it was at a much higher level at MIT. The physics offered at MIT required calculus. I wasn't ready for that level of physics. The chemistry was at a much higher level. Biology, we were talking about gene splicing and genetic engineering and how to do that stuff. In the first biology course, I didn't understand that. I wasn't ready. I lived in a poor neighborhood, went to a school that wasn't that good. I was very underprivileged, and I didn't get a good education that prepared me basically to succeed at that level. So I didn't do very well, and I felt awful. I felt like I couldn't do well, and I felt miserable. And then I stopped trying. I felt less motivated, and then things got even worse. And eventually I even failed the courses that I knew I could pass. So I didn't stay there, and I left, okay? And like I said, I picked myself up again. I went to a community college after that. Actually, first I took an extension course at UCLA, which I did well. I took my first psychology course at UCLA through the extension program. And then I decided, and I took astronomy there, which I did well. And then I decided to then go to a community college to basically, so I can then transfer to another 4-year school, because I wasn't yet ready to transfer. You needed to be at the junior level to transfer. So I did that, and I found community college to be very easy. I went there, I did very well. And as I succeeded, I felt better about myself. And I got it, and then I did even better and felt even better. And in 1 year, I was basically, I transferred out of there. In 1 year, I transferred out, and I basically transferred then to UC Riverside, where I also did very well. And as I did better, I gained more confidence. I was more motivated, and I did even better. And then graduated from Riverside a year later. I only spent 1 year there after transferring, because I took courses in the summer. They were on the what I call the quarter system. I took courses in the summer, and I advanced pretty quickly, and I did very well. And I graduated with like a 3.8 or something like that, almost a 4.0. I wasn't quite summa cum laude, but I was close to it. So I graduated with honors really well, and I got into USC for a PhD program. And I got there, and by that time my self-efficacy had improved dramatically. And I went there, I did well, and then I graduated, got my PhD, and then here I am, teaching you guys here. Okay, but you can see, the point is, you can see how low self-efficacy has a way of kind of making people feel worse, and then destroying their motivation, and they get even worse and worse. And then when that happens, when you've hit bottom, basically, all you have to do is get up, try again, right? And as you begin to have some success, you feel better, your self-efficacy increases, then you get better and better, and you can have the opposite happen. You can spiral upward. I've experienced both of them. That's how powerful self-efficacy is. Even for people who are very capable, I consider myself to be very capable. I did very well in high school. It can destroy your confidence and destroy your ability to do well. That's self-efficacy. That's how important it is. And it doesn't just apply to academics. It applies to all kinds of other things. I mean, anything really. Plumbing. If you do plumbing and you encounter a problem that you can't solve and you fail at it, it has a tendency to make you feel worse. and then you get worse. But if you do well, then you feel like you can do things well. Now, plumbing is not my thing. I'm not good at it. But there was a time when I had to install a new toilet because the old toilet didn't work anymore and it was really old. So I decided to get rid of it. Bought a new at the Home Depot, and I was going to pay somebody to install it for me. And when I asked about it, the guy at the Home Depot told me, oh, it's actually very easy to install a toilet. All you have to do is do this, this, and this, a couple of steps, and it's done. And I say, oh, that sounds easy. I can do that. So I did. I installed my own toilet. And after that, I felt really good about myself. I felt like, wow, I did this, right? I could probably also install, sinks and faucets, and I can probably do all these other things. And I started feeling that I can do all of it, basically. I cannot do all of it, but I have, over the years, I've gained more self-efficacy, especially being a homeowner. And yeah, now I can replace sinks on my own. I can fix those leaky faucets. I can replace all the sinks, and I can do all that stuff now. I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but I can do some basic maintenance. I can do some basic stuff. And that's what happens when you do things and have success. Self-efficacy goes up, and then you feel better about yourself, more motivated, and you have more success. And that's how it works. It works that way going down. It works that way going up. Low self-efficacy ruins you. High self-efficacy can make you have success. Okay, let's keep going. Let's talk more about this, because it's like I was telling you my life story there for a moment, but it relates to self-efficacy. Sources of information about self-efficacy. How do you know how much self-efficacy you have, whether it's high or low or you're somewhere in the middle? One is performance attainment. So how well have you done in the past? Previous success demonstrates abilities and increases self-efficacy. Failures lower it. You know you have a high self-efficacy if you have succeeded in the past. If you've had success, then you probably have high self-efficacy. You believe you can do things well. If you had a lot of failures in the past, you've gotten a lot of bad grades, let's say you've lost jobs, failed at marriages, relationships, things like that. If you had a lot of failures, you probably have low self-efficacy and feel kind of bummed out and feel like things don't work out well for you and you can't really do things well. But also feedback from teachers, exams are important indicators of performance. If teachers tell you that you're smart, that you can do this, right, then that increases your self-efficacy and you're likely to do better. Or if you do well on the exam, you feel good about yourself, then you feel like you can do even better, right? Those are all importance of indicators of performance. Positive feedback increases that feeling of competency, increases self-efficacy. Negative feedback reduces it. It's important as teachers that we tell our students what they do well and not just what they're missing, okay, what they're not doing so well. It's important that we motivate our students by basically focusing on what they can do well to increase self-efficacy so they do even better, instead of basically just chewing them out and telling them they're awful. And I have seen teachers do that, by the way. I have, I once had an office right next to an English teacher's office, and a student once came into her office to ask for help. And she started looking at his paper, and I could hear what they were saying or what she was saying. And she's just started ripping this person, she just started saying like, what, this is awful. I can't believe you would even turn this in. This is ridiculous. How could you be so careless? And this is stupid, and saying some really awful things. I heard nothing from the student. He was just there while the teacher was saying all these awful things about him. And I started thinking, what an awful thing to do. That is not what you do with students. Even if they are failing, even if they do badly, you shouldn't tell them those things. You need to tell them that they can do better if they try, if they study, if they do this, this, and this, right? Because negative feedback, especially things that are insulting, will reduce self-efficacy, and then they'll do even worse. You need to encourage them. Vicarious experiences as well will improve self-efficacy. Seeing other people succeed increases self-efficacy. That happened in my family, right? My brother got in, my second oldest brother got into Berkeley, and then when he did that, we felt like, hey, we can do it too. We can also do well in school and go and get into a good college. And we all kind of did after him. Even though my first brother, my oldest brother, didn't set a good example. He dropped out of high school. And then my second older brother was the one that set the example for the rest of us. And then we all went to college after that. And it wasn't just us. It wasn't just people in my immediate family, my brothers and sisters, but it was also my cousins as well who knew about this. But one of my brothers, my second older brother, he was the first to go to college in my family because we come from immigrants. My mother, right, immigrated to this country, left my dad behind in El Salvador. He was abusive and things like that. My mom left him. She came here. So did some of my other family, and came here a long time ago, by the way. And we all got amnesty from the Reagan administration and we became citizens. But my parents were immigrants and had, jobs in factories that didn't pay very well. Not very good working conditions, got paid very little. We were all very poor. But just with, one person's success, we felt like we could succeed too. And that's what kind of changed everything. So seeing somebody else succeed can also make you feel like you can succeed too, increase your self-efficacy. But it's helpful if it's someone who's close to you, someone who is like you. If it's someone who's very different, it may not improve your self-efficacy that much. I mean, I knew of other people who have succeeded before that, but it wasn't so relevant because, I didn't know any Latinos that had succeeded, okay? Or anyone in my family, right? And that's not as helpful. When somebody close to you succeeds, you feel like you can do it too, because hey, if your brother can do it, your sister can do it, why not you? Verbal persuasion also helps, right? Reminding people that they can achieve increases self-efficacy. Verbal persuasion must be realistic, however. So telling people, telling students, hey, I know you can write this paper. You just have to take it step by step, Hey, do the title page, do that abstract, do that, that biography section, do this, take it step by step. It's not as hard as you think. You just need to take it step by step. Take it in little pieces, right? You tell them things like that. That increases self-efficacy. Writing the whole paper as a whole might seem like a big deal, might seem daunting, right? But if you break it up into manageable steps, you can do it, right? You can do those little steps. You put them all together. That's the whole paper. The persuasion must be realistic. I teach research methods. Students have to do their own research and then write it up in an APA paper. As a whole, that project can seem very daunting to do your own research, but we take it step by step, right? We do, first do that survey, right? And I help them with that. I show them how to do surveys and do the survey, collect the data, analyze the data, write up the method and results section, and now write the whole paper, write the other sections, okay? You have to tell people that they can do it, but you be realistic. Don't tell them, that they can get into Harvard when they're, failing their classes in high school. It has to be realistic. You have to tell them first, you can pass these classes. You just need to do this, this, and this. You need to study, you need to ask for help, right? It needs to be realistic, and you get there step by step, right? Don't get too ahead of yourself. Yeah, maybe you can still get into Harvard and things like that, but you have to take care of other things first, right? And have more realistic goals first, and then they just build up, right? At first, in my family, it was like, first, it was just getting into college, and then, succeeding in college. And then after that, once you succeed at that, say, hey, I can go to graduate school, right? And then after that, I can get a job or whatever it is. But you build on this success, right? You need to have realistic goals. It may not be too realistic to look from, from high school all the way up to the end, right? Where you just imagine yourself just being rich, right? That's probably not realistic, but you can have, other goals that are more realistic, and maybe you'll still be wealthy in the future, or maybe not. Most people won't be. But the persuasion, right, must be realistic. But that's verbal persuasion matters, right? You need to tell people they can do it. And if you tell them that, and you give them, tell them to set realistic goals, and you encourage them, they're more likely to believe in themselves. By the way, it's not just believing in yourself that matters, okay? You also have to have the skills. You must believe in yourself and also have the skills. You can believe in yourself all you want. There's plenty of people who say, oh yeah, I'm gonna be awesome. I'm gonna be great. I'm gonna get into the best colleges. And they can barely read and write. They can barely do any math. That's not realistic, right? It's not just believing in yourself. You have to be able to develop the skills, or you have to have the skills. So you need to take it step by step. Physiological and emotional arousal also matters. You're more likely to believe you can cope with something like a challenge, right? An exam, a paper, or difficulty, whatever it is. If you're not tense, fearful, agitated, or stressed out. Here's the thing. When we are fearful, when we are tense, when we're anxious, when we're stressed out, we're more likely to procrastinate. We're more likely to give up. We're more likely not to try. I know I have felt that. If I feel really stressed out, really anxious, I feel like I don't even want to do this, right? You're more likely to give up if you feel that way. So you need to calm yourself down, take it step by step. Try not to get too stressed about it. Other things help as well, physiological things, like proper diet, stress reduction techniques, exercise, right? These things increase strength and stamina, improve your ability to control your physiological and emotional reactions. And it improves your ability to cope. If you follow a healthy diet, if you exercise, if you are healthier, then it's easier for you to cope with anxiety, with stress. It doesn't overwhelm you as much. Stress is anxiety, fear. It's a physiological reaction. And if you're healthier and more fit, you can deal with that physiological reaction better. And of course, just reducing your stress overall, which, by the way, exercise helps reduce stress. That's how I manage stress, is through exercise. And it's a wonderful thing, you know. It really helps you reduce your stress. And when your stress levels are lower, you do better. Okay, it's just you feel better, you do better. I actually started exercising years ago. Started jogging, started hiking. I've always hiked, but I mean, I started doing it more regularly and for longer periods of time. Actually exercising consistently, vigorously, not to lose weight. I was never interested in that. I haven't been overweight, but it was really to reduce my stress. The way it started actually is one day I had a big fight with my wife, and I just felt like I needed to get the hell out. Get the hell out of the house. So I got out and I drove away. I just thought I needed to get away from there. Okay. And I drove away. I just drove and I wound up at Vasquez Rocks and I parked there and I was still very angry, agitated. And I said, you know what? I'm going to go and I'm going to walk around this whole stupid thing. I need to think, I need to do something. I had so much energy, so much stress, right? Felt so agitated. That's what I decided to do. And I walked around the whole thing. And as I did that, I felt better. And that's how my exercise started. I felt better. And I started doing it afterward to relieve stress. And for me, yes, my biggest source of stress is my wife. We argue a lot. My wife is very difficult. I'm not saying I'm not, but my wife is, she fights with me a lot. And when I don't have a way to cope with that, I feel worse. I feel awful. If I didn't have a way to cope, I probably would have left already, to tell you the truth. Okay. Some people cope in different ways. Some people drink. Some people have affairs. Some people just leave, right? And separate, get divorced. You know, I've been coping with exercise. But yeah, our marriage is difficult. My wife is difficult. We don't get along that well. We have a special needs kid that makes it even harder. But for the sake of my family, I want to keep it together. I know my son needs me, right? He's special needs. And my daughter cares about me too, although she doesn't always show it because she's like my wife. But, you know, I want to keep my family together. And as long as I can cope, I'll still be there. Well, unless one day she decides to kick me out, then, well, then that's that. Okay. Let's talk about the developmental stages of self-efficacy, how self-efficacy develops throughout the lifespan. So let's talk about childhood first. So children have limited cognitive ability. So children are not that good at remembering things, not that good at figuring things out, okay? Their attentional, imaginal, and verbal abilities are limited, okay? They can only imitate behavior immediately. So children can only copy behavior that they observe and that they get to try out immediately. Not hours later, not days later, they won't remember. So children's self-efficacy is limited, right, to what they can do immediately. And here we're going to talk more about just, learning through observation, although this relates to self-efficacy. The behavior that is modeled needs to be in the range of their sensomotor development. And it has to be repeated. So you can model like walking for a child, but if the child's not ready to walk, they're not going to do it. But you can show them, how to play with a certain toy, and you can do it over and over again, repeat it for them. And then they try it immediately after. And then you do it again. This is how you do it, right? Whether you're teaching them how to bounce a ball or how to play with a little remote control car, right? It needs to be within their range of sensory motor development, and you need to repeat it for them a lot. And young children, you need to use reinforcement as well. Young children are reinforced by physical stimuli. They're reinforced by food, affection, punishment, things that they can feel, right? So you can give them food. You can give them candy. You can give them a potato chip, or even something healthy like fruit. You know, if they manage to do something correctly, you can reward them with that. You can reward them with affection by giving them a hug, by smiling at them, saying nice things. And you can punish them when they do something wrong. I wouldn't punish them if you're trying to get them to do something like if you're trying to teach them how to walk and they can't do it and you punish them for that. No, I'm not saying that. But let's say they do something wrong, like a child pulls his sister's hair. You punish them for that. And by punishing them, I don't mean beating them. There are more appropriate ways of punishment. Beating your children is considered physical abuse. But all that can help children grow and learn. And as they learn, their self-efficacy increases. Older children learn to associate physical reinforcers and punishment with approval and disapproval. Older children, you don't necessarily have to use physical things like food and toys and things like that to punish them or reward them. Just disapproving of them, just telling them you're disappointed in them, or telling them they did something wrong, you know, things like that. That's enough for them to know that they did something wrong or they did something right. They don't require physical consequences as much as younger children. Later, rewards and punishments are self-administered. As children get older, they begin to punish themselves. They feel bad without the parent even know it. They feel bad themselves. They feel ashamed. Okay, and they feel good about themselves and they do something right. So they develop self-reinforcement and self-punishment. More about childhood. Childhood is going to take the most time when it comes to explaining this. Okay, self-efficacy develops as children exercise control over their physical and social environments. As children learn to crawl, and they learn to walk, they learn to talk, they learn to do things right, how to color, how to trace their shapes, right? How to do their letters, how to read, how to write, all these things. As they learn all these things, they're able to do these things. They develop self-efficacy. They start developing this idea, right, that they can do things well, that they have control over their physical environment, over their social environment, that they can actually get things done. They learn because of physical growth, social and language skills. Okay, so there's a lot of things that happen. They grow physically and they learn things physically and socially. They learn how to make friends, how to talk, right, and to develop, those language skills. Those are all part of them basically just developing. And as they learn all these things, they develop self-efficacy. They act on their environment and the parents. Okay, so they learn to do things. They may learn to throw a ball, learn to clean up after themselves, whatever it is, and also act on their parents. They learn to manipulate their parents, to get their parents to give them ice cream or get their parents to get them a toy. They learn how to influence their parents. Good parents provide opportunities for their children to use their abilities, opportunities for the children to crawl, to walk, to play. Play is very important. Children learn to play a lot, right? To talk, to develop friendships. Parents need to provide all these opportunities so their children develop these skills, these abilities, and as they do that, their self-efficacy develops and grows. Research has shown that men high in self-efficacy had fathers that were warm, and they had demanding mothers with high standards. So for children, according to research, fathers need to be encouraging. They need to be nice. Mothers can be a bit more demanding, have high standards. It's usually the mothers that are more demanding of the kids, that they want them basically to do well in school and will go over their work with them, their homework. The fathers are not as involved. It's more important the fathers are nice, right? And that the mothers are a bit more demanding, have more high standards, and demand that they do good work. Women high in self-efficacy receive pressure from their fathers, okay? When you're talking about women who develop high self-efficacy, it was their fathers that were the ones who were more demanding, okay? And their mothers, were the ones that were more nurturing. But men who develop high self-efficacy, it was the opposite. Their fathers were nice, their mothers were demanding. For women with high self-efficacy, it was their fathers who were the more demanding ones. That's interesting how it's reversed there. More about childhood. As children grow, their parental influence lessens, right? The child's world expands, right? They develop friendships, they have peers. right? And as they get older, they start caring less about what parents think and more about what their peers think. So they encounter and care about what they see from their siblings, their peers, and other adults, especially their peers. Okay, they care a lot about what their peers think, and they will do things that they see their peers doing. Right, their peers serve as models. If they had bad role models and their peers are basically, not very well behaved, they will develop some bad behaviors themselves. So they start caring more about their peers, right? That becomes a better source of information for them as far as how they should, what they should do than their own parents. And they will start caring also about other adults like teachers, okay, who demand that they act a certain way. Firstborn children judge their behavior differently. Firstborn children grow up around the presence of adults more, okay? They don't have other siblings, so they grow up in the presence of adults, okay, more than the presence of children. So therefore, they judge their behavior a little bit more harshly, and they tend to basically, mature more quickly. Same-sex siblings are more competitive than opposite-sex siblings. Yes, same-sex siblings, are more appropriate models for each other if they're the same sex, and because of that, they compete more and they learn from each other. Teachers also affect cognitive and problem-solving skills. Students need teachers that, that are good teachers, that have good skills, that are experienced. But experienced, successful children also serve as models. Children also learn from other children, okay? Which is why ability grouping is helpful to self-efficacy. If you have like a special ed class, for instance, and all the kids in there are behind, the kids don't advance as quickly as if, let's say, you put a kid that, let's say, is behind in a regular class where they have other children who are more successful as role models. Putting, let's say, all the kids that are behind, all the special ed kids together and all the smart kids, together is not as helpful for those that are behind. They need to see successful models. They need to see other children who are doing well and learn from them. Grading on a curve is also harmful to self-efficacy. If you grade on a curve, all you have to do is be close to the average in order to pass. And what happens is that children get worse and worse. They get lazier and lazier, right? Because they figure out that, or even students, even older students, they figure out all they have to do is be close to the average. They don't have to try that hard. When I first started teaching in college, I wasn't so sure about how good of a teacher I was going to be. So I graded on the curve, the first exam. And I found out that the average was like 50. And that was ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. And I did not think that was acceptable. And I said, there's no way that you guys should be getting a passing grade for getting 50%. That's usually an F. So after the first exam, I got rid of the curve. Say, I'm no longer grading on the curve. If you want an A, 90% or more, B, 80% or more, right? And I graded on that scale, and that's what I've been doing ever since. And what I found is that students met the challenge. They got better. The average went up. And I still had students getting A's, B's, C's. I had some that didn't do well. But if I grade on a curve, I found that students got worse and worse. So I got rid of that. Students will meet the challenge, right? If you have, certain standards, some of them will meet those standards. Not all of them will. But grading on the curve is not very good for self-efficacy. They try less and less, and they do worse and worse, and they think they can still pass. And, and it reduces self-efficacy because their percentage, goes down. The percentage that they score goes down. And psychology is not as hard as other classes, okay? Not as hard as chemistry, not as hard as physics, not as hard as math. There's no need to grade on the curve when it comes to a class in like psychology or other classes that are not as hard. And that's why psychology is very popular, by the way. It's considered a major that's not too difficult, at least not in undergrad. It's harder as you go higher because it actually involves statistics and doing research. And that is not as easy as just basically taking classes. During adolescence, things change. Adolescence involves coping with new demands, relationships, sex can become a factor, career, college, right? So a lot of things change during adolescence, and there's increased standards for self-efficacy. Teachers, coaches, parents demand more of adolescents. They demand that they write better, that they do better math, right? Coaches demand that students perform that athletes perform at a higher level. And everyone is more demanding when you're an adolescent. You're starting to look like an adult, and they're going to start treating you like one. So it becomes harder to meet these standards. Even your peers and models for comparison, right, become harder to match and surpass. You might have thought you were smart in elementary school, and then you get to junior high and let's say high school, and all of a sudden, you may find that you're average and you're no longer among the top, right? Because now you have more competition. Your peers have advanced. A lot of people have advanced, and you're actually going to have more students that are smarter and at higher levels. Same with athletics, right? You might have been doing well in elementary school, and then you get to junior high and high school, and you might find that you're not even good enough to make the team. You're not good enough all of a sudden, right? Even when it comes to looks, you might have thought you were pretty in elementary school, and then you get to high school and there's a whole bunch of pretty girls. And now you might find that you're actually not among the most pretty. But that's what happens as you go higher. It's your competition gets tougher, and it becomes harder to be among the top. You know, I found that out as well. When I was in elementary school, where like athletic, I was like the second fastest kid in my school. I felt pretty good. I felt like I was pretty fast, pretty athletic. And by the time I got to high school, yeah, I made the track and field team, but there were different levels. And even in basketball too, I made the basketball team, but I wasn't at the highest level. Not like I was playing varsity basketball or even junior varsity. We had also below junior varsity, we had B's, and then below that we had C's. I played B's and C's, right? I wasn't good enough for junior varsity or varsity basketball in high school. I was in the track and field team, but even there I was at the lower levels. I was at the lower level. I forget what they called it, if it was B's and C's as well, but I was the fastest in my group, but there was a group ahead of me, and they were the ones who were the more skilled ones, the more athletic ones. So I wasn't at the higher level, but I was good enough to make the team, right? Academically, though, I was still pretty good, and I was among the best still academically in high school. I actually graduated high school. I was the valedictorian, but I wasn't the only one. There was 3 of us that were tied. Okay, so academically, I actually got better. I continued to get better, and I was among the best in my high school. But when it comes to athletics, I found that I was okay. It was good enough to get in the team, but I wasn't good enough to basically be a star athlete or to even be at the varsity level. Success depends on the level of self-efficacy established in childhood. If you do well in childhood, self-efficacy goes up, and you'll probably continue to do better. If you weren't doing very well, your self-efficacy probably will remain lower. Not sure how I'm doing on time here. Okay, I think I'm doing okay. Adulthood, during adulthood, things are different. During young adulthood, there's demands of marriage, parenthood, career, right? So a lot of things change during adulthood. And if you have high self-efficacy, that yields better outcomes. If you believe you can do things well, you're more likely to succeed in college. You're more likely to have a good career, right? If you believe in yourself and you have the knowledge and skills, you're more likely to be a better parent. You're more likely to have a better marriage. Okay. High self-efficacy matters in adulthood as well. In middle adulthood, things change again. According to Bandura, middle adulthood is a stressful time, right? Where you start to reevaluate your career, your family, your social life, goals, skills, opportunities, and there may be opportunities for enhancing self-efficacy. So this sounds, middle adulthood, right? Like the midlife crisis. That's what Bandura is talking about. The midlife crisis, right? Where all of a sudden you start worrying again about what you're doing and whether you're doing what you wanted to do with your life, and you start reevaluating things. And it's stressful, and you might decide to make changes or take on new challenges and have opportunities for enhancing self-efficacy, take on other careers, things like that, right? It's a stressful time. It's not that way for most people, is what research suggests. Most people deal with middle adulthood quite fine and don't really have a midlife crisis. I don't think I'm having a midlife crisis either. I know who I am. I know what I want to do. But getting along with my wife is very, very difficult. Raising kids, it's very difficult. I'm doing that in middle adulthood. I should have been done by now, by the way, because in the past, the way it was and the way it is for most people is they have children when they're in their 20s. And by the time they're in their 40s, especially mid 40s and beyond, they're done. I am not done. I started like 10 years late. So I'm still raising little kids instead of having teenagers or even grown children like a lot of the people I went to high school with have. So for me, it is kind of stressful. And I have a special needs kid, and my wife is crazy and it drives me nuts. And I say that jokingly, by the way, but it is difficult. My wife is very difficult. And, so are her sisters. I think it's a biological thing. Her mother was very difficult, and her mother got divorced. Her dad left her mom, when she was 40. My wife is 40 now. And yeah, she's driving me crazy. And sometimes I tell my wife, it's like, I hope history doesn't repeat itself, but, sometimes I feel like we're not going to make it. Right? And we might repeat the same thing. And if that does happen, I'm not going to blame myself. It seems like there's a cycle here where I married a very difficult woman and she comes from very difficult people. Okay. But I'm hoping I'm going to be the nice person, and I'm going to hang on and everything's going to be okay. Because I know that my wife is a good person. She's a good woman, but she is very difficult. But it is a stressful time for me during this, middle adulthood. I don't think I'm having a crisis, but it's just, but it is difficult. Old age, that's when retirement happens. There's declining physical and mental ability. So physically you decline, you're not as healthy. Mentally you also decline, you're not as sharp. Your memory may not be as good, right? Social life changes, right? You probably don't go out as much. Actually, you even start losing loved ones. Some people die, get sick and die, and you may not see them as much. You may lose them. And self-efficacy declines during old age, according to Bandura. Because as your health declines and your mental ability declines and your relationships suffer because of illness and because of death, you feel worse about yourself, and you feel that you cannot do things as well as when you were younger. And it doesn't matter so much what you believe. Your body is declining and your abilities will decline, and that will affect your self-efficacy. But plenty of people remain healthy and sharp during old age. It depends on whether you've taken care of yourself, followed a proper diet, exercise, right? And you stay, mentally active as well. If you read and you're still involved, you solve problems, or you're still active in some way. Just because you retire doesn't mean you have to stop learning, or it doesn't mean you're just gonna sit there in a rocking chair and kind of, waste the hours away. You need to stay physically and mentally active if you want to be healthy in old age, and if you don't want to feel that way, like your things are getting worse and you have declining self-efficacy. But it doesn't matter what you do. Eventually, it will catch up with you. Eventually, this will happen to you. It may not happen in your 60s if you're healthy. It may happen later when you're in your 80s if you should live that long. But it will eventually happen. Let's keep going. Let's talk about behavior modification. We talked about behavior modification when it comes to Skinner's theory, right? That's to do with rewards and punishment. Remember that Bandura's theory is more about learning through observation. There are still rewards and punishment, but it's learning through observation. And there are behavior modification programs, therapies based on Bandura's theory. Behavior modification, from the point of view of Bandura's theory, the goal is to modify or change undesirable behavior that's believed to result from learning. Okay, so that's similar to Skinner's theory, except that the approach is going to be a bit different. Behavior modification, when it comes to Bandura's approach, it's going to involve a lot of observation, a lot of modeling. So modeling, for instance, watching somebody do something well has reduced like fear of dogs in children and snake phobia in adults. Modeling can help reduce fears, right? There are children who are very afraid of dogs. And if they see another child or an adult, approach a dog carefully, with its owner, of course, it's on a leash, and asks for permission to pet the dog and, pets the dog, then the children won't be so afraid of the dog. Or see an adult handling a snake, right? A non-poisonous snake, a non-aggressive snake, right? Then the child will be less fearful of snakes. Modeling can be used to reduce fear, all kinds of fears, even fear of public speaking, all kinds of things. There's something known as guided participation, where you watch a live model and then you participate with the model, okay? And it's step by step. So first you watch a model handle the snake through the window. So let's say you have snake phobia, you're extremely afraid of snakes. First you watch someone handle a snake through a window, so at a distance, right? You're not even in the same room. And then you work up the nerve to watch the model in the same room. And then you work up the nerve to touch the snake with gloves, right, while the model holds it. And then finally you work up the nerve to touch the snake without gloves. So little by little, you overcome your fear, but you do it live, okay? There's something known as systematic desensitization, where you also reduce your fears, but that's done through your imagination, where you imagine doing these things. Guided participation, you do it live. There's also covert modeling, which involves imagining a model coping with a feared situation, not a live model. That's called covert modeling. And one form of that would be systematic desensitization, which I talk about in Psych 101. More about behavior modification. Modeling has also reduced fear of medical treatment and surgery in children after they watch a film of a boy's experience in the hospital. So there are children that have to undergo surgery for any number of reasons. And surgery is really scary for adults, and it's especially scary for children. One study showed that if children are first shown a film of a child that's just like them, that's going to have surgery, they show the children before the surgery, and they go into surgery. They don't really show that, but then they show the child after surgery, and that everything went okay, and that they're doing okay. Then children aren't as fearful after that. Modeling has reduced test anxiety and improved test scores in students that watch a film of someone coping with test anxiety. Modeling is very useful. If you see other people doing something, right, then that increases your self-efficacy. You feel like you can do it too, and it reduces your fear, your stress. Let's keep going. Assessment. So that's it for Bandura's theory, but let's talk about the assessment part. What did Bandura do when it comes to assessing people, studying people? Bandura was a real scientist, okay? So he used quantitative analysis. The non-mothetic method, that just means that he did experiments, he did research, right? He had experiments on several individuals in the lab. He applied statistics to determine averages. He tested differences among samples. So he was a real scientist, a researcher. He's probably retired now, but Bandura actually was a professor and researcher at Stanford. I know this because I applied when I applied for grad school. I applied to Stanford. I wanted to work with him. I didn't get in there, and I didn't end up working with Bandura. Instead, I got into USC, and I ended up working with someone else. Okay. Direct observation. He also used direct observation. He observed the behavior of participants, not just him, but others, his graduate students. Basically, observation by 2 or more psychologists. Remember, observations work best when there's more than one person, so you can check the extent of agreement between the 2 observers. Also use self-reports, right? Surveys, questionnaires, used interviews. He did everything, basically. That's scientifically valid. Okay, he was a real researcher, a real scientist. He used physiological measures. He checked heart rate. He looked at muscle tension, brain waves, all kinds of things. So he was a real researcher, a real scientist, and he knows how to do research. And I believe he's still alive. Maybe I need to look it up, but he was already old when I applied to work with him, more than 20 years ago. I'm sure he's retired now. I don't know if he's still alive. Probably, I don't know. He would be really old by now. More about self-efficacy. Research on self-efficacy says that men are higher in self-efficacy than women on average. Men believe they can do more things successfully than women. On average, they have higher self-efficacy. And that has a lot to do with opportunity and the things that we're taught. And yeah, we do live in a kind of male-biased society, a male-dominated society. So you have more examples of men being successful than women, and men are encouraged more than women, and that will affect self-efficacy. Self-efficacy increases through childhood, right? As children get, learn how to walk and talk, and they get better, right? It peaks in middle age. In middle age, you're about as good as you're going to be, okay? And declines after 60. When you retire, your skills, decline, because usually once you retire, you don't challenge yourself as much. You're not working as hard, and that affects your ability to do things well. Okay. Self-efficacy is possibly related to physical attractiveness and height. What that means is that if you're physically attractive, if you're tall, you're more likely to believe in yourself. You're more likely to do things well. You have higher self-esteem, higher self-efficacy, especially when it comes to dating and relationships. You're tall, you're physically attractive. Yeah, you believe you can have a successful marriage. You're going to meet the right person. And even if your marriage doesn't work out, you believe there's somebody else out there for you. You're very desirable. If you're not so attractive, if you're not as tall, you're less desirable, then of course you're going to struggle more with relationships. You're going to believe less in your ability to, attain a good relationship. Self-efficacy is also positively related to academic performance, motivation, effort, and persistence in class. And I've said this before. Yes, if you have high self-efficacy, that usually also means you're doing well in class, you're doing better academically, and you feel more motivated, right? You try harder, and you keep trying, you persist when things get hard. Other research on self-efficacy in jobs. When it comes to men, men have high self-efficacy for both typical and female typical jobs. So men believe they can do it all. They can do those male typical jobs like construction and engineering and stuff that involves heavy lifting and things like that. And they feel they can do all the women's jobs as well. They can do the nursing, they can do the teaching. Men believe they can do it all. Women's jobs, they think that's not even that hard. Women have more high self-efficacy for traditional female jobs. Women do suffer a bit with lower self-efficacy when it comes to jobs that are more traditionally male, like construction. They may not feel they have the strength, the ability to do those things, or things like plumbing or engineering or math. Men still have quite a big advantage in those jobs, often because of their size and their strength. But even jobs that don't require size and strength, like engineering and math, right? Men seem to do better at those jobs. And over 90% of the engineers are male. It's a more traditional male job. Women are not encouraged as much. So women do not have as much self-efficacy in those areas. Those with high self-efficacy also widens career opportunities, enhances interest, increases job hunting. When you believe you can do things well, you believe in yourself more, right? You're more likely to apply for different jobs, study different things, and believe you can do different things. And I had high self-efficacy when I finished graduate school, or right before I finished, when I was applying for jobs. I applied for teaching jobs, I applied for researcher jobs, I applied for government jobs, doing research for the government. I also applied even for jobs in the medical field because I know how to do research. I know about data, and they deal with lots of data and research. I applied for all those things. I didn't get a job in those fields. I ended up getting a job teaching. Okay, those high in self-efficacy also, have increased personal goals, right? They focus more on analyzing and solving problems. They believe more in themselves, and they believe they can solve problems better, and they're more analytical. Those that have low self-efficacy have narrow career options. They don't believe in themselves that much. They're more likely to believe that they're only good at this one thing, and that's what they're likely to try to find a job in. They're more indecisive, less job hunting. They're less likely to look for a job and less likely, to focus on jobs that are different than their skill set. They focus more on their deficiencies, things they can't do, rather than things that they can do, more than on their strength. And they're more fearful of failure, that things are not going to work out. And I've been there. I used to have low self-efficacy and try to get jobs during that time, and it wasn't very good. I've been on both ends. Self-efficacy and physical health. Yes, self-efficacy also affects your physical health. Women with high self-efficacy, when it comes to giving children, they have an easier time. They have less discomfort, less pain. They require less pain medicine, okay? More pain tolerance, more endorphins. They have an easier time with childbirth and delivery. Those that are higher in self-efficacy Also are better able to resist peer pressure, to start smoking, more likely to stop smoking. They're more likely to exercise, more likely to be able to control their weight, more likely to have safe sex, recover better and faster from physical illness and injury. And that goes for everyone, men and women, okay? Those that have lower self-efficacy also are more likely to be alcoholics. Let's keep going. We're almost done. More about self-efficacy and mental health. Those that have low academic self-efficacy are going to experience more depression, more high anxiety, more neurotic behavior. They're going to worry more. They're going to be more anxious. And then the depression will further reduce the self-efficacy. I've been there. I've shared that story already. Those that have higher self-efficacy have more social interests, more likely to get along with others, more likely to help others. They have more of a desire to strive for perfection and get better, more of a sense of belonging. Okay, they're very able to cope with stress. They have a stronger immune system because stress lowers your immune system. I mean, lowers the strength of your immune system. So if they have lower stress, usually their immune system also work better. They have less stress-related hormones, less respiratory infections, healthier in general. Those that have high self-efficacy. Self-efficacy, according to what we just found out, is related to everything, to jobs, right? To academic performance, to health, physical and psychological health. It is something that is extremely useful, and it's a central theme of Bandura's theory of personality. Okay, that is where we'll stop.